A pleasure to meet all at last. Welcome back once again to HJN Super Graphics, and more importantly, I feel like that it's time to get things going when it comes to the more paranormal side of games. One good way that we can pretty much take this on is by talking a bit about Ghostbusters. For 2601, let's talk a bit about Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed. So, for October of 2022, or at least fall of 2022 in general, there were certainly a lot of games that I had gotten a hold of. The second half of 2022 alone was certainly a huge point in my lifetime. I mean, this was the point where my brother and his, wife-to-be came along. And essentially, when they got married, that didn't happen for a while, but it sure was quite an event. And then, of course, there were trips that I had taken place. There were a lot of games I got a hold of, a lot of the movies that came out. There was just a ton of stuff that went down in the whole year entirely. But at this very point in time, I might as well talk a bit about one of the games that came along at that point, known as Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed. So, here we go. This game basically takes us all the way to Ghostbusters headquarters, which of course is the firehouse, familiar to anyone whom has watched the movies or even the cartoons or whatnot. In almost every point of media that we've seen so far, the firehouse is deemed as Ghostbusters HQ in all accounts. Even some spin-offs and branch-offs and whatnot still use the firehouse as the main hub for where Ghostbusters plans are settled, especially when Secretary Janine Melnitz is put into perspective and in charge of the phone calls and whatnot. But in this instance, the only true Ghostbuster that we seem to encounter within this situation is none other than Winston Zeddemore. Yeah, kind of like how in the more recent Ghostbusters movies that we had gotten a hold of, the likes of Winston Zeddemore happen to play quite a big role in the plot here. And in this game, it's almost no different. But we'll kind of get to the more enticing bits about Zeddemore and the plot in a moment here. So in any case, there is in fact an in-game avatar customization tactic that you can pull off here. And Zeddemore in fact recruits you, the player, in order to investigate a series of paranormal dilemma that takes place all over New York City. And there's a variety of different locations in which that you can head off to alongside your team of Ghostbusters. Or you could even go solo at it if you want to. The thing is though, is that if you remember from my recent review of Crash Team Rumble, the likes of Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed happens to work in a similar fashion in which that you have either the Ghostbusters that you can play as or as the ghosts themselves that you can play as. Now, in my experience as the Ghostbusters, the main thing that you gotta do here are a couple of different tasks. The biggest, most important thing, apparently, is to calm down the residents or occupants of the buildings inside. And the buildings could be anything. Libraries, museums, other such locations that the ghosts can inhabit, of which that you eventually have to pursue and find out clues as to their whereabouts. And when it comes to the detective stuff, it seems really basic for what it is. Finding clues, discovering where the ghosts are hiding, and then attack on sight with your proton packs. And eventually set up the traps. Activate them at the right point, and the ghosts are sucked up, the game's over at that point. That's basically how each and every match format is put together. However, the main thing about this game is that, unlike Crash Team Rumble, it does in fact have a story. Yeah, so opening with the Ray Parker Jr. theme song is one thing, having Winston Zeddemore as the main guide for all this stuff, as well as the main plot point, is another, but having an actual story that even lasts for a little while is truly something else. Yeah, so the thing is that from Zedmore's perspective, there's a series of events going down in the same regard as how when we've seen in the movies, the TV shows, and all that implies. even with the most recent Ghostbusters sequel that we got last year, known as Frozen Empire. It's pretty much no wonder why we got ourselves another game that happens to give us something else entirely. There's a lot of mileage that you can get out of the Ghostbusters franchise itself, and it's also just another piece of living evidence that Ghostbusters is a franchise of so many possibilities. There's a lot of ideas that you can take in and put out, and it would never get boring. I mean, you could have the Ghostbusters travel back in time. You could have the Ghostbusters go to a baseball game. You could have the Ghostbusters watch their own movie in Hollywood. You could have the Ghostbusters go on a date with Janine, or possibly anybody else in any means. You could have the Ghostbusters tell backstories about themselves. You could have Slimer going in a hot dog contest alongside Joey Chestnut. Or you could even have the Ghostbusters marathoning through horror movies. Just to name a few. There's just so much that you can do with the franchise. And Spirits Unleashed certainly did manage to kick it up a notch here. I mean, you got your own customizable player that you can adjust to your liking, of course. Even modify their voice. I will say my experience as a Ghostbuster, I did pretty well here. And going through the movies, the cutscenes that take place in the game itself, even to the point where Zedmore gets possessed. Whew! That's really something. But I also have to mention about how I felt playing as the ghosts themselves in the game. The same ghosts that you can capture while as a Ghostbuster. Because in this instance, being able to play the ghosts is a bit different here. You have to scare the people inside. You have to get them to run out. You have to get the Ghostbusters to evacuate the building. You have to get the whole place haunted to the point where it's uninhabitable. Yeah. Quite simple if you ask me. While the Ghostbusters might be a bit of a tedious rundown, a bit of a job, playing as the ghost seems to be a bit more of a simple trade, right? But the main problem with that is that the Ghostbusters might make it difficult for you, and if they spot you, they will catch you with their proton packs and traps and other such weapons in their arsenal. Now, we'll say that the game itself might not really be a bore in the same way as how Crash Team Rumble would be a good time killer, provided that you are in a good mood or mindset. But Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed, in spite of how it is different than the likes of Crash Team Rumble, even having its own story involved with cutscenes, the main thing is that in order to progress through the story itself, you'd have to keep going through matches. And there's sometimes set objectives that you have to do in order to progress the story at all. Sometimes it will happen. Sometimes it could be random. Sometimes you might not even know that you have to do a certain something in order to progress even further. But most importantly, I find this to probably be a bit better than the likes of Crash Team Rumble. Not just for the fact that it has a story and cutscenes involved, which help make it more worthwhile to play through as much as you want. Even if it might get a bit monotonous because you are in a repetitive state here, clearing out buildings, capturing ghosts, calming people down every now and then, finding clues, collecting items every now and then. There's also the added benefit of not needing to have a PlayStation Plus subscription. So, unlike Crash Team Rumble, Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed does something different. This certainly wasn't a product of Toys for Bob and Activision. No, this in fact comes from another developer. Somebody who's a bit more recent, known as Illphonic. And you know what? Much like some other companies that I've talked about, like Nacon, Sumo Sheffield, and others, I get the feeling that Illphonic might be on a good run here. You might even remember when I talked a bit about Stray, with the likes of other smaller gaming developers and publishers. So you know, I highly would recommend supporting these smaller creators so that way they can grow up to be big and strong. Just like how the likes of EA, Square Enix, and Treyarch have managed to get bigger over time. And so, My overall summary and scoring of Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed is that it's pretty good with its own variety of gameplay, customization, as well as its own storyline. And there's even a DLC known as the Ecto Edition upgrade. And I will say, the Ecto Edition of the game is pretty colorful, especially with all those ghosts in the foreground playing, popping out of the trap. So, for the scoring though, it's going to be at a somewhat meager 7.3 out of 10.1. So probably better than the likes of Crash Team Rumble, mainly for not having the drag of getting a PlayStation Plus subscription, but also managing to be a bit less on the monotonous and repetitive act, mainly for the rewards being that you get storyline cutscenes, progression systems, upgrades, and other things. So, I will say that with the fact that both games having the online multiplayer factor in it does seem a bit repetitive in the same way at how Dead by Daylight gave us that same vibe of playing the same thing over and over and over again. We at least have a lot of stuff to look forward to with Dead by Daylight. There's a lot of horror franchises that they've been able to add with dozens of DLCs and whatnot. And who knows, maybe I could revisit it with all the new stuff that we got going on. But until that happens, that's my overall view of Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed. And if you stay tuned for tomorrow, there will be plenty more for me worth talking about here in HJN's Super Graphics. So make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.